Listen carefully, because this part is not meant to scare you. It's meant to wake you up. There was a moment when you felt it deep inside, a quiet pull on your heart that you couldn't explain, a sense that something wasn't right and that you needed to change course. You remember it. You may have brushed it off, laughed it away, or told yourself you'd deal with it later. But the truth is, you heard the warning long before the trouble showed up. God says, I spoke to you when your life was still calm, when you still had choices, when turning back would have been easier than it is now. It didn't come with thunder or fire, it came softly. It came in a thought you couldn't shake, in advice from someone you didn't expect, in doors that suddenly refused to open, no matter how hard you pushed. It came in that uncomfortable feeling that whispered, this path isn't right, even while everything around you seemed fine. God says, that was not coincidence. That was care. That was love trying to protect you before the damage became visible. You told yourself it wasn't serious. You said everyone lives like this, or I'll fix it later, or it's not that bad. And in those moments, the warning didn't disappear, it waited. God says he gave you space because real love does not force, it invites. He allowed you to choose because obedience that comes from fear never lasts. But obedience that comes from understanding can change everything. Think back to how many times the same message reached you in different ways. A repeated mistake, a pattern you noticed but ignored, a relationship that kept breaking you down, a habit that quietly took more than it gave. God says he does not repeat himself without reason. When the same warning shows up again and again, it's because the danger is real, even if you don't feel it yet. You weren't warned because you were weak. You were warned because you were valuable. God does not warn what he plans to abandon. He warns what he intends to save, but instead of stopping, you slowed down just enough to feel better about continuing. You didn't fully reject the warning, you postponed it, and postponement feels harmless, until suddenly time has moved forward without your permission. God says, I warned you while there was still room to turn around. The problem is, comfort has a way of dulling urgency. When nothing collapses immediately, we assume nothing ever will. When consequences delay, we confuse mercy with approval. But mercy is not permission to continue, it's an opportunity to change. You thought the warning would come again in a louder way, maybe when you were more ready to listen. But God says the first warning is often the clearest, because it's not mixed with pain yet. Once pain enters, the message feels harsher, not because God changed his tone, but because the cost of ignoring him has increased. This is why you feel a weight in your spirit now. This is why certain words hit deeper than others. This is why this message feels personal, even though no one knows your story. God says, I warned you before it was too late, not to shame you, but to spare you. The warning was an outstretched hand, not a pointing finger. And even now, this is not about regret, it's about recognition. Seeing clearly where the warning began helps you understand where obedience must start. God is not asking you to go back in time. He is asking you to stop pretending you didn't hear him, because here is the truth that cannot be ignored any longer. The warning you dismissed is the same warning trying to reach you again right now. And this time, it's not asking politely, it's asking honestly, will you listen before it's too late? And that's where the truth becomes heavier, because the part you didn't want to face is this time was never neutral. It was moving, even when you weren't. While you told yourself, not now, the clock didn't pause out of respect for your comfort. God says time is a gift, but it is also a test. And every delay quietly answers a question about what truly matters to you. You assumed there would always be another chance, another sign, another moment when things would feel more convenient. But convenience was never priced. God says, I gave you time, not so you could waste it, but so you could use it wisely. Every warning came with a window, and every window came with an expiration you didn't bother to check. Think about how quickly days turn into years, how intentions stay intentions while habits become permanent. You didn't wake up one day and decide drifting happened because you kept telling yourself you'd act tomorrow. God says tomorrow is the most dangerous word when it becomes an excuse instead of a plan. There were moments when you felt urgency, when something inside you said, if you don't change now, you're going to lose more than you expect. But urgency makes us uncomfortable, so we silence it. We distract ourselves. We stay busy so we don't have to be honest. God says time kept moving, not to betray you, but to reveal what you were choosing to ignore. You thought delay was harmless because nothing collapsed immediately. Your life didn't fall apart overnight, so you assumed you were safe. But God says some consequences don't crash, they creep. They drain your peace slowly, they dull your sensitivity, they make you forget who you were before compromise became normal. Time was not against you, but it was not waiting for you either. Every season that passed without obedience made the next step harder, not because God withdrew, but because your heart slowly learned how to resist without feeling guilty. And that is one of the most dangerous places to be when delay no longer bothers you. God says, I warned you because time reveals truth. It shows whether faith is real or just convenient language. It exposes whether obedience is a priority or just an option you keep on the shelf. You didn't lose time all at once. You spent it on things that couldn't save you when the moment finally arrived. And here's what hurts the most. The warning wasn't meant to rush you. It was meant to protect you. But protection only works when it's accepted. God says time is like a door that opens quietly and closes without announcement. You don't hear it shut until you try to walk back through it. You assumed you'd notice when it was getting too late, but being too late rarely announces itself. It feels like normal life until one day you realize something is missing, something has shifted, and the ease you once had with God is harder to find. That's not punishment. That's distance created by delay. Still, this is not about hopelessness. God says the reason this message reaches you now is because time, though not endless, is still breathing. But understand this clearly, every warning ignored narrows the margin. Every delay makes obedience cost more than it had to. You were warned because you were given time, and time was given because God believed you could respond. The question was never whether time would pass. The question was always what you would do before it did. And somewhere along the way, without realizing it, you started choosing what felt easier over what you knew was right. It didn't look like rebellion. It looked like practicality. It looked like survival. It looked like saying, I'll obey God when things calm down, or I'll do it once I feel ready. But God says, obedience is rarely convenient. And that's exactly why. It reveals the heart. You knew what was being asked of you. You felt it clearly. Walk away. Speak the truth, let go, change direction. Trust me. But comfort spoke louder in the moment. Comfort said, stay where you are, at least it's familiar. Comfort said, this hurts less than the unknown. And without saying it out loud, you agreed. God says comfort is subtle. It doesn't drag you away, it invites you to sit down just long enough to stop moving forward. You didn't stop believing, you didn't stop praying. You just stopped obeying in the places that cost you something. And partial obedience feels safe because it keeps your conscience quiet while your life slowly drifts off course. You chose what felt manageable over what required faith. Obedience demanded courage, and courage meant risking loss. It meant disappointing people. It meant standing alone. It meant giving up control. Comfort asked for none of that. Comfort let you keep what you had, even if what you had was quietly breaking you. God says, I didn't ask you to obey because I wanted to restrict you. I asked you because I could see where that road was leading. But when comfort is involved, warnings feel exaggerated. You convince yourself that the cost of obedience is too high without calculating the cost of delay. Think about H. How many times you said just a little longer. Just a little longer in that situation. Just a little longer with that habit. Just a little longer avoiding that decision. God says comfort always asks for just a little more, and it never tells you when enough is enough. Obedience would have required you to feel uncomfortable temporarily. Comfort promised relief immediately. And in a world that worships ease, immediate relief feels like wisdom. But God says what feels good now is not always what saves you later. You weren't lazy. You weren't careless. You were tired. And comfort knows how to speak to tired people. It tells you rest means staying the same, when sometimes rest actually comes from change. God says, I was offering you freedom, but comfort disguised itself as peace. Every time you chose comfort, obedience didn't disappear, it waited. But waiting obedience doesn't stay neutral. The longer you delay it, the heavier it becomes. What once felt like a clear step starts to feel like an impossible leap. Not because God moved the standard, but because comfort weakened your willingness. You told yourself you'd obey when it felt safer, when you had more clarity, when the timing made sense. But God says obedience is often the thing that creates clarity. You wanted assurance before action, while God was asking for action before assurance. Comfort kept you busy enough not to feel guilty, distracted enough not to feel convicted. You stayed occupied, entertained, involved. Anything to avoid sitting alone with the truth that obedience was calling and you weren't answering. God says the most dangerous comfort is the kind that feels productive but keeps you disobedient. And here's the part that hurts to admit. You knew comfort was costing you, but the cost felt distant. Obedience felt painful now. Consequences felt hypothetical later. So you chose the pain you could predict over the pain you couldn't. God says that choice makes sense to the human mind, but it slowly trains the soul to settle. Still, God never stopped calling. Even while you were choosing comfort, grace kept whispering. Even while you stayed, mercy kept knocking. Obedience didn't expire, it waited for you to decide whether comfort was worth more than becoming who you were meant to be. And when comfort no longer worked, when the quiet warnings were ignored, the gentle nudges were brushed aside, the signs didn't stop, they changed their volume. What once came as a whisper began to rise into something harder to dismiss. God says he does not shout without reason. When the message gets louder, it's not because he lost patience. It's because the danger got closer. You started noticing disruptions you couldn't explain. Things that used to work suddenly didn't. Doors you expected to open stayed shut. Peace you once had felt harder to reach. God says that wasn't random. That was the warning shifting form, trying to reach you in a way you could no longer ignore. At first, you called it stress. Then you called it bad timing. Then you blamed people, circumstances, even yourself. But God says the signs became louder because silence wasn't reaching you anymore. The whisper didn't fail, you tuned it out. So mercy raised its voice. You felt it in repeated frustration, in setbacks that felt unnecessary, in moments where everything inside you said, something is wrong, even when nothing obvious was. God says those moments were not meant to break you. They were meant to interrupt you, to stop you mid-stride before the fall became unavoidable. What you labeled as obstacles were often alarms. What you called attacks were often interventions. God says, sometimes the storm is not sent to destroy you, but to wake you up before you drift too far from shore. But when storms arrive, we don't usually ask what they're trying to say, we just ask how to make them stop. The signs showed up through people too. Conversations that hit too close. Words that lingered longer than expected. Advice that irritated you because it touched something true. God says he sent voices into your life, not to judge you, but to echo what he had already been telling you privately. And still, part of you resisted, because louder signs feel uncomfortable. They disrupt routine. They challenge narratives you've built to stay comfortable. God says it's easier to explain away a warning than to obey it, especially when obedience requires change you're not ready for. So the signs intensified, not all let on, see, but enough to be noticed. Enough to create tension between where you were and where you knew you were supposed to be. God says this tension is holy. It's the space where truth confronts habit. You may have asked, why is this happening to me? Without realizing the question itself was part of the answer. God says it was happening for you, not against you. The warning wasn't meant to scare you. It was meant to slow you down before speed turned into loss. But louder signs demand a response. And when response doesn't come, pressure increases. Not because God enjoys pressure, but because unchecked direction leads to irreversible places. God says ignoring a warning doesn't cancel it, it converts it into consequence. You felt the weight growing. Joy became heavier. Prayer felt strained. Decisions felt foggy. God says when alignment is lost, clarity follows. The louder signs were invitations to realign, to stop pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. And still, grace held back the final blow. Even in the loudness, mercy was present. God says every sign, no matter how intense, still carried an exit. A way back. A moment to say, I hear you now. The tragedy was never that the signs got louder. The tragedy was that you almost got used to the noise. Almost accepted chaos as normal. Almost mistook warning for fate. But God says warnings are not destiny, they are direction. The storm wasn't proof that God left. It was proof that he stayed long enough to intervene. And even now, the fact that you recognize the signs means the message hasn't ended. It's still speaking, still urging, still calling you to see what you tried so hard not to hear. And even after all of that, after the whispers, after the waiting, after the louder sign and the interruptions, understand this clearly: what you experienced was not anger first, it was mercy. God says mercy always speaks before judgment ever shows up. If judgment were the goal, the warning would have never come at all. You assume that correction meant rejection, that being warned meant you were already in trouble. But God says warnings are proof of patience. They are evidence that he was still making room for you to turn back. Judgment ends conversations, mercy starts them. And the fact that the conversation kept going means grace was still active in your life. You thought mercy would feel gentle, comforting, reassuring. Sometimes it is, but God says mercy can also feel urgent, unsettling, even uncomfortable, because its purpose is rescue, not relaxation. Mercy does not always speak in soothing tones. Sometimes it speaks in truth that shakes what you've built on unstable ground. Every warning you received was mercy slowing things down before judgment had to step in. You weren't being threatened, you were being protected. God says if he wanted to expose you, he wouldn't have warned you privately. If he wanted to punish you, he wouldn't have given you time. Mercy gave you space. Mercy gave you moments. Why gave you exits you didn't always take? You mistook patience for approval. Because nothing collapsed immediately, you assumed God was okay with your direction. But mercy is not agreement. Mercy is restraint. It's God holding back consequences you weren't ready to face yet, hoping you would. Choose wisdom before loss made the choice for you. God says judgment is quick. Mercy is long-suffering. Judgment doesn't repeat itself, mercy does. That's why the message kept returning in different forms, not because God was changing his mind, but because he was giving you every possible opportunity to change yours. You were spared things you didn't even realize could have happened. You were protected from outcomes you never saw coming. God says mercy doesn't announce everything, it blocks. Sometimes you only understand how close you were after you look back and see what didn't destroy you. And here is the part most people misunderstand. Mercy is not infinite in expression, even though God is infinite in nature. Mercy has timing. Mercy has seasons. Mercy waits, but it does not wait forever. That's not cruelty. That's order. Without limits, warnings would lose meaning and choices would lose weight. God said, judgment only enters when mercy has been exhausted, ignored, or treated insignificant, not because God wants to judge, but because truth must eventually stand. You were not rushed toward judgment. You were walked away from it step by step, warning by warning. Think about how many times you could have fallen harder but didn't. How many mistakes should have cost you more but somehow didn't. How many doors closed gently instead of slamming shut. God says that was mercy cushioning the impact while still trying to redirect you. You thought the warnings meant God was displeased with you. In reality, they meant God was still invested in you. He warns what he loves. He corrects what he claims. He intervenes where he sees potential worth saving. Judgment doesn't explain itself. Mercy does. Judgment arrives unannounced. Mercy sends messages ahead of time. And everything you've heard up to this point, every nudge, every interruption, every sign was mercy, saying, please don't make me step aside and let consequences teach you what obedience could have. Even now, mercy is speaking, not with condemnation, but with clarity, not to shame you, but to awaken you. God says the warning came first because mercy always goes first, and the fact that you're still listening means mercy has not finished its work yet. And now, after everything that has been said, after every warning, every delay, every moment, mercy stepped in before judgment. This is where it all comes together, because this moment is not random. God says, if you are hearing this now, it means the door is not closed yet. Time is not gone yet. Breath is still in your lungs for a reason. This is not just another message passing through your ears. This is a wake-up call meant to reach your spirit. God says, I die. did not bring you this far to stay asleep. You may feel like you've missed too much, delayed too long, failed too often, but the fact that you can still feel a conviction means your heart is still reachable. You might be tempted to think, I've already messed up. What difference does it make now? But God says that thought is the enemy's favorite lie. Because if he can convince you it's already over, you'll stop responding while there's still time to turn around. This moment exists because hope still exists. This is the point where excuses stop working, not because God is harsh, but because clarity has arrived. You can no longer say you didn't know. You can no longer pretend you didn't feel it. God says awareness is responsibility, and now you are fully aware. You are not being asked to be perfect. You are being asked to be honest. Honest about what needs to change. Honest about what needs to end. Honest about what you can no longer carry into the next season of your life. God says delayed obedience is still disobedience, but immediate obedience can still rewrite what delay damaged. This is why the message feels urgent, not panicked urgent. There is a difference. Panic comes from fear. Urgency comes from truth. God says this is the moment where neutrality is no longer an option. Standing still is a choice. Waiting longer is a decision. Silence is an answer. You may be waiting for a final sign, something dramatic, something undeniable. But God says this is it. This awareness, this stirring, this discomfort you feel right now. The last wake-up call rarely comes with noise, it comes with clarity. Don't misunderstand what last means here. It doesn't mean God wants to abandon you. It means He wants you to understand the weight of this moment. When mercy speaks this clearly, it's because the next step belongs to you. You don't need to fix everything at once. You don't need to see the whole path. You just need to take the step you've been avoiding. God says obedience doesn't require confidence, it creates it. Movement brings light. Action brings alignment. This is where cycles break. This is where patterns lose their grip. This is where you stop explaining and start responding. God says heaven is not waiting for your perfection, it's waiting for your surrender. You may feel afraid of what obedience will cost you, but God says disobedience has already cost you enough. What you're being asked to release cannot compare to what you're being prepared to receive. Right now, the noise quiets, the excuses fade, and the truth stands in front of you without disguise. This is the moment where you either soften your heart or harden it further, where you either step forward or stay comfortable and stuck. God says you have been warned. You have been given time. You have been shown mercy. And now you have been awakened. What you do next will determine whether this warning becomes a turning point or a testimony of what you almost changed but didn't.